Hello, you beautiful degenerates, and welcome to Links and Locks, the Network's golf betting podcast presented by Bet365. This is your tournament betting preview for the 152nd Open Championship from the Old Course at Royal Troon this week. It's the final men's major championship of 2024. We've had three stars from the top of the leaderboard, or from the top of the odds boards, win at the Masters with Scotty Scheffler, Xander Schauffele at the PGA Championship, and Bryson DeChambeau at the US Open at Pinehurst #2. But we believe this one might be the most open of all of them, or wide open of all of them for anyone to win. We'll break down our outright betting cards in a moment, and then we'll also get through everything else we've bet along with our course preview. We'll touch on the Barracuda as well, the opposite field event. Shout out to the ISCO Championship, formerly the Barbasol, where there was a five-way playoff. Harry Hall won in exciting fashion last week. Not as exciting, unfortunately, as Robert McIntyre, who ruined Nick's 100-1 bet on Adam Scott. Spencer had a live ad on Robert McIntyre on Saturday night. So, Spencer, I'll swing it to you. What is your best bet for the 152nd Open Championship, our last major of the year?
Yeah, I've gone a little bit cold on the start of the show. Like there was a run early in the year where I want to say I hit 14 or 15 of these best bets in a row, and feels like now we're on the opposite end of it. And to me, one of the ways is, how do we get back in the winner's circle? Well, we fade somebody who is the last major champion. So I am going to take Colin Morikawa -120 over Bryson DeChambeau. That number has been on the move over the last 12 hours or so, but I'll break down why I like that in a second.
All right. So Spencer is not afraid of Bryson DeChambeau fading the bomber. Nick, what is your best bet for the
Yeah,
Open?
he's coming out swinging. I don't have that much juice behind this play, but a guy that just been a serial cup maker all year long, friend of the show. We talk about him all the time and back him almost as often as Tony Finau and Alex Noren, but I will go Siwoo Kim top 40, where Ty's paying full at +115.
All right. Siwoo Kim, shout out to him. 8 under par on Sunday at the Scottish Open. My best bet last week on him was, I believe, 60th or better, and then also had him in the top 40 market. He cashed both of those after being outside the number on both of them entering Sunday. So let's see if we can keep Siwoo Kim rolling. I've got a feeling we're going to talk about him later on as well. For my best bet, going back to the well, I'm fading Jordan Spieth. He and Brian Harman are in a matchup, 120 -120 juice either way. I'm backing the reigning champion golfer of the year, Brian Harman, to beat Jordan Spieth in a 72-hole matchup. Before we can get into that Longhorn on Georgia Bulldog matchup, Spencer, why are you fading Bryson DeChambeau this week?
So I've said this before on other podcasts. I don't know if I've really talked about it here, but I come from a poker background before anything else. Like we can talk about any of the nuanced factors that are important to succeed in that game, but one of the things that makes a really good poker player is the ability to adapt when you see the strategy start to change from your opponents. I've talked a lot on this show over the past 2 years about not betting star versus star matchups, trying to find miscut equity further down the board. All of that's still going to remain true as a blueprint. The number one thing that I'm trying to find, but books have made it a lot more challenging over the last few months. Essentially, I've seen them possess, and we were talking about this even before we came on air, they've possessed a much greater understanding of who the fade candidates are going to be weekly. And then they're either placing those options against one another at a much higher rate or putting you into these positions to where you have to lay these -175, -1,200 odds to take on the golfers that you really want to do. I know we're going to lose some of your implied probability advantage by going towards the top of the board. There's a much higher likelihood chance that this is going to stretch for 4 days. But I've noticed, and this is something that, I ended up, funny enough, with this battle here, I ended up betting Rory last week against Colin Morikawa for very similar reasons, and that ended up being a push. And we'll get into all the reasons why I like Morikawa throughout the show, not just for this section here, but I've noticed that these softest matchups continue to come into the spot where a golfer is being pushed way too far up the board for one reason or another. I thought DeChambeau was the prime example of that here. You look at some of the expected off the tee statistics, and that's where DeChambeau is going to hold his biggest advantage. Inside of the top 6 of my model during the first 3 majors of the year, He dropped to 39th overall for expected total driving when I ran it for Royal Troon. I think there's an ability for him to get off to a hot start each day when he plays the short par 4 locations. It just for me, and this is not the upside part of the answer. This is safety. This is talking about a matchup and trying to figure out which golfer is going to finish better than the other one. You take Morikawa's safety and some decent high-end marks included into that, and you throw it into this volatile nature of what DeChambeau's bringing to the table. I'm going to take him on with this particular golfer. I know I always talk about if there's a matchup against somebody else, see if you can find it. I'm not necessarily that heavy in that stance this week. I do tend to believe that you're going to have two sets of minds of where people are with DeChambeau. You're going to have the group that we've seen 3 consecutive good major finishes to start the year, including his victory. You're also going to have a group of people that are not going to want to play him for things like DFS contests because you're going to hear this answer of accuracy over and over again. I probably land somewhere in the middle. I don't necessarily think this is some spot where I expect DeChambeau to blow up. Just picking a price here against the golfer that my model had as one of the best plays on the board.
By the way,
Ballsy.
that matchup last week with Morikawa and McIlroy was a barn burner. That was crazy if you're keeping up with it in real time on Sunday. But going away from fading Morikawa last week to backing him this week against Bryson, Nick, why are you backing Siwoo Kim this week in the top 40 market?
Again, my answer is not nearly as decorated as Spencer's here, but he just checks every single box for me. I had this price at like minus 110 where ties are in full. I'm surprised that you can even find this number this large, I guess, but anybody like can go like I have a phrase with some of my friends when we roster Siwoo and DFS, like they go full Siwoo or full Keegan. Usually Keegan's the guy going in the drink. We'll talk about Keegan in a while. But even the bunker play, the sand saves, I wouldn't even know if I'm like handicapping sand saves because pot bunkers are a lot different than what we see on the United States, and actually like getting up and down from those bunkers. I'm pretty sure like getting in a pot bunker. I played the course on the simulator with my 6 handicap. I lose a stroke and a half when I go in the pot bunker. Like I get it out, but I got to hit it backwards most times. I'd imagine most pros have to do something similar, but we'll get it up and down maybe for bogey at that point. But he's driving the ball insanely well. He's relatively long. His mid to long irons are great. His short irons are great. The wedge play is great. Really, like the thing I devalued this week more than anything is kind of the putting with these smaller greens. I've been hearing on PGA Tour radio all week long that these are slower than what we saw at the Scottish Open last week at the Renaissance Club. So, if there's one thing that would scare me with Siwoo Kim, it's going to be his putter, which has actually gotten better this season too. I just feel like he's a great golfer. He's consistently finishing inside top 20, top 25, even some top 10s this year. I don't think he really has the legs to maybe win this thing unless the scores do come in right around like that 10 under range and he can find a way to play safe. And I don't think there's any water for him to ruin our day on, but just a very safe golfer. And I'm getting a price that my numbers think is valuable. But I do want to kick it over to Spencer real quick. Just like I was very shocked to hear him go that stud against stud matchup. We've talked about that on this show a couple times over the past few years, but I was looking at that matchup too, just because like everybody's, if you're making models or just even looking at recent form and even open history championship. I know Collins Open was kind of benign conditions, like super clear, super low winds, like everything was great there. He's kind of playing American golf and just lit that place on fire. But Colin is incredibly accurate off the tee. His approach game is second to none, or maybe second to Scotty if you want to say that. And his short game out of nowhere this year has just become one of the highest caliber short games on the PGA Tour. So sure, Colin Morikawa like is probably inside everybody's top 3 or 4. But to pick on Bryson is just interesting to me. Like I want to fade him in DFS. I think the public's probably going to do that just because the narrative of distance won't necessarily help you here. But there's just something about him and the way that he just thinks his way through a golf course that I think is very interesting. So I don't know if I'll in pod play that one because usually I always follow Spencer's best matchup bet. But I love Morikawa, but there's something about Bryson that I don't know. I trust the guy's game a little bit, but I do think it's a horrible course fit. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's an overcorrection that we have seen inside of the betting market. And maybe some of that undervalued narrative that you're talking about for DFS, because I don't think anybody's going to want to play him. And that's where he becomes intriguing. Like, look, I mean, he's the second most expensive player for DFS. The betting market has moved in the opposite direction. We're starting to get some normalization from what the expectation would be from it. I typically try not to go in this route, but if we're not going to get the prototypical matchups to where I can find the fade candidate that I would like to take on, and there are a slew of them, and you almost can get them just one after the next where they're matched up against one another, which is the unfortunate thing. Like, you have to deviate from what is not working. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to find situations where I am much higher than the books are, or I'm much higher than the market would be on a certain player, but we haven't necessarily gotten that in back-to-back weeks. And even when we got a spot in the last tournament where I was much higher on Bjork and much lower on Billy Horschel, get a miscut versus miscut battle there. And there seemed to have been a lot of that has come into play, unfortunately, where like the price, like the bet was one of the biggest win totals I had. You told me Billy Horschel missed the cut. I would have told you Alexander Bjork's 37th place finish would have been just dandy there, but that's not what ended up happening. He didn't play well. I'm just trying to build this model in a little bit of a different capacity. And I do think that there are opportunities where books are slower to react at the top of the board right now.
Yeah, I'm with it. I guess looking at Bryson's history, really the only quality Open Championship finish he had was at St. Andrews, where you and I had a huge week that week in betting and
Wide
DFS.
open.
It was just pretty, just bombing putt. So I get it. I'm with you there. Maybe it is an impact play now, Roberto. Lock it in. I'm convinced.
Let's go. Already got an impact play. I think Bryson's going to be absolutely fascinating to watch. I think he's fascinating to watch every week, but seeing him on links golf, where these golf courses are normally favoring accuracy over driving distance. Justin Ray put out a tweet earlier today where he said, since 2014, 55% of Masters, PGA Championship, and US Open winners have ranked in the top 10 that week in driving distance. Obviously, Bryson DeChambeau in the top 10 in driving distance, all three of those this year. None of the last 8 Open Championships winners have ranked in the top 10 that week in driving distance. So it's normally been driving accuracy. Obviously, Brian Harman last year, super accurate off the tee, pounded those fairways. You got to avoid the big missed fairway penalties, whether you're in a gorse bush, out of bounds, in the long wispy rough, or even in a bunker, which, as you've noted, Nick, is just a pitch out straight up sometimes. Takes your approach out of play on that second one. So there is going to be a premium on hitting these fairways, but downwind, especially on those first 6 holes that can be really gettable, some par fours under 400 yards. Bryson DeChambeau could drive some of the greens or get really close to it and make it almost like St. Andrews a couple of years ago, if the winds and conditions are right for him. I think that's going to be fascinating to watch. And also seeing on some of the par fives where there's a berm that everybody's laying up in front of, he can carry it. And some of the other longer drivers can hit it over the berm as well, leave just a short iron in on a par 5. That's going to be really fun to watch. And then seeing these guys hang on for dear life, following the postage stamp and on the last third of the course, I think it's going to be a lot of fun this week. But that gets me to Brian Harman, who, as we just noted, super accurate driver of the golf ball. That remains true this season on the PGA Tour. And right now, just looking at a few different places that I trust, namely Data Golf's rankings have Brian Harman 18th. They have Jordan Spieth 57th. Spencer, your model has Brian Harman 13th this week, whereas Jordan Spieth is 48th in your model. So in those two rankings, Spencer and Data Golf's, Spieth not in the same caliber of class as Brian Harman right now. We know, and we discussed this at length last week on the pod, Jordan Spieth has this magic that he can conjure up, and especially on links golf where he can use his creativity and that amazing short game. But right now, it just feels like something for Jordan Spieth. It's not consistently one thing. It could be his putting one week, it could be his short game, could be his iron play, could be his driving, although the driving relatively this year has been arguably the best of his entire career. Something has gone horribly wrong every week. Last week he misses the cut because his putting is really poor and his approach play is really poor. A couple weeks ago at the US Open, he was one of the best in the field on approach play, but then he's one of the worst putters in the field. And then a couple weeks after that at the Travelers and John Deere, he's terrible off the tee or terrible around the green. So you never know what's going to go wrong with Jordan Spieth right now. He's got a much lower floor than Brian Harman. Spencer's the master of these matchups. You normally want to bet somebody with the high floor against somebody with the lower floor. I think Brian Harman's got a high ceiling. Obviously, he's the winner last year here. And I think Royal Liverpool is one of the more similar courses to Royal Troon in the open rota. Obviously, the greens being much smaller this week, I think, is a key distinction. But off the tee, there's going to be a similar premium on hitting the fairways, at least on the last 12 holes of the golf course that aren't potentially going to be drivable. And so I really like Brian Harman's chances of at least making the weekend, getting into the top 20-ish range and hanging around there. And if Jordan Spieth beats me with a great week, he beats me, but I'm willing to take that risk, just like we've been doing for the majority of the season on the show, fading Jordan Spieth. And I don't know that we've lost a single one of these. So let's keep it rolling by fading Jordan Spieth. Gentlemen, we've discussed Royal Troon, the old course there, in some length. Let's go into it even further before we go into our outright bets. Spencer, I'll sling it to you. What did you weigh in your model for Royal Troon this week?
The Royal Troon has been very consistent with the results it's produced over the years. 6 consecutive winners at the venue had been American since 1962, before Henrik Stenson's 2016 victory. We had also gotten 5 of 7 tournaments delivering a winning score between 10 and 13 under, with Stenson's result once again proving to be that core outlier when he got into that shootout with Phil Mickelson at 20 under versus 17 under. I don't necessarily want that to hold so much credibility. You look at the wave advantage they have, you mix that into the fact that JB Holmes landed third on the leaderboard at 6 under. All those answers come into play. However, that sort of pushes me into this point of the discussion that I wanted to have, since even though we've gotten some steady expectations of what to expect here over the years, there is this shift at the track that has occurred since last seeing it in action that's going to modify some of the statistical expectations that we get for the week. 9 holes have received brand new tee boxes. That's added over 200 yards to the property. I think that distance is really noteworthy in my mind. You look at the thick rough and fairway bunkers, those are going to be one of the course's best defenses outside of wind of any link style venue that you talk about. But it does for me. I understand the flip of that mentality to where if you want to say, well, if you look for distance, you all of a sudden already build a different sort of a model. That's more of a DFS. How can I get different? Like, I want safe golfers. I want to protect against what we're not going to probably see, this bomb and gouge mentality. Players are going to experience a true one-stroke penalty if they go wayward with their drives. That includes gorse bushes that can come into play if you miss to the wrong angle, really deep bunkers like we've talked about, all of us on this show already. To me, that highlights the importance of finding the short grass at its bare minimum level, but it's also not as if the fairway lies are always going to be perfect either. Undulation comes into play throughout to accentuate this strategic link style approach where you need to correctly traverse the course and you need to do it from a very methodical perspective. Maybe Bryson's ability to think outside of the box is what gives me more optimism than what my model would if we're looking for just pure upside and the ability to put it together. But Troon doesn't necessarily make any of those answers that I've talked about straightforward when you dive into holes moving in all directions. One of the complexities that adds is that players are going to get different ball flights from hole to hole from a venue that's going to be naturally predisposed to wind. I don't necessarily see this extensive negative weather forecast as bad as it could be, but no link style course is ever completely removed from your random gusts. You know, that's one of the reasons why for DFS, I always say, wait as long as you can to actually finalize your player pool. We got to make some more decisions. It doesn't necessarily mean in every single market, but you know, there are matchups where you're going to have to pick and choose your spot and hope that you get into the right end of the draw with it. But yeah, that to a back nine, that was already one of the most complicated on the PGA Tour rotation. I think you add these changes that have occurred. This is going to be a difficult complex that's probably going to even be a little bit more challenging than we've seen. So I don't know if that means the winning score ends up being 10 under or if we're in that 13 under range, but to me, probably somewhere in that section is what we're going to inevitably get, even with the softer conditions of, I see 15 mile per hour winds, give or take throughout the day. Like that's slow enough for me that I'm not going to make a massive fuss inside of my numbers to try to deviate away from like the calmer conditioned golfers.
Yeah, every week on the PGA Tour, the winning score is pretty wind dependent and dependent on how firm or lack thereof the conditions are. So that's not going to be any different this week in links golf, where that'll even be magnified as well. Nick, anything you'd like to add on Royal Troon and what you weighed in your modeling this week?
No, I mean, Spencer nails it every single week. He's the reason I build my numbers kind of the way I do. Overall, I'm just looking for informed golfers that kind of check every single box of being accurate. I do think distance will be a little bit of a difference maker for me in comparison to what everybody's kind of handicapping from 2016. Spencer mentioned all the different yardages that have been added. Some holes like 60 yards. I know the par five, what is it? Hole 623, is that number 4? Can play like over 620 yards. Like I do think with the downwind, multiple players can get there, but who's hitting an iron into that is kind of how I want to handicap, because I do think like the scoring, or we know the scoring is going to come from the front 9, if not the first 6 or 7 holes. So who can kind of get there, get a wedge in their hand, or get there into on the long par 5 with an iron ideally, and then who's going to kind of play damage control on the back. So just well-rounded golfers, but I do think I will be adding a little more emphasis to distance in my DFS side of things. And when you look at my card for who I bet, I feel like most of these guys are above average in length off the tee, other than Siwoo Kim, which we'll get into him for a little bit.
The 6th hole is the 623 yarder. The 4th hole is also a par 5 at 599. I believe that 623 yarder is the longest par 5 in the Open Rota. Also wanted to add, Spencer, you noted on the additions to the golf course, the 9 new tee boxes, roughly 200 yards of distance added. I think that the angles that these new tee boxes come at are also important, and being able to pick your line and execute not only on that line, but the distance on that line, because if you hit the right distance, but it's on the wrong line, or vice versa, you might end up in a gorse bush or in a pot bunker, or et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch that this week. I always love the gorse bushes. I love it when there's an actual penalty where you get screwed, unless, of course, there's a sprinkler. But we're moving on. Gentlemen, we'll start with you, Spencer. Who is on your outright card this week, and who are you betting to be the champion golfer of the year in 2024?
A lot of these decisions for me in all 4 majors, at least at the very top, have come down to, do I want Xander Schauffele exposure or do I not? I've talked all season about how Schauffele continues to be undervalued in this market because of his public perception. I know his PGA championship has removed some of that lack of win equity stigma that was attached to him. I still think there's this general belief from the public every week that doesn't necessarily give him the credit that he deserves for the golfer that he's become. I ended up, all of that being said, going with Morikawa at 18-1 over Schauffele, just because of some of the recent form difference that both have presented when I ran my numbers from Schauffele's PGA championship win and past that moment. Some of the long-term data made this very close. That's where this became a tough decision, because if you can shop around and find 15-1 out there, and the best that you have on Morikawa, hypothetically, let's just say you can still find him at 18-1 if you look around. But I know that, I mean, as much as I stress everybody needs to have as many books as possible, I know not everybody out there does. And when you start putting this in a range where one's 15 and one's 16, I think we can have a little bit of a different discussion there. The one pushback that I will continue to give is, if you look into these data points when comparing the two since Schauffele's victory, there has been this shift in what Xander has produced as of late versus what Colin has. Xander's lost around the green in 3 of his last 4 starts. He's averaged only 0.2 per start off the tee over the last 3 tournaments. Those numbers paled in comparison to the fact that Morikawa has gained a minimum, and that's a very key statistic for him, a minimum of 1.54 strokes per event in all 4 critical strokes gain metrics. It's going to obviously give you the approach that leads the way at 3.22. The biggest difference maker for Morikawa, and I know he's another name that this stigma is getting attached to him, that he's not getting across the finish line. But if we look at what he has done around the green and with the putter, completely different player over the last couple of months here. So I thought 18-1 was still too shallow because of that lack of upside that he has shown, at least as getting across the finish line. I took Tommy Fleetwood at 25-1 and Tyrrell Hatton at 28-1. I've said this numerous times. I gave this answer last week about Matthew Fitzpatrick. Didn't necessarily come to fruition for me, but there are certain golfers, Fleetwood, Hatton, maybe more so than any 2 golfers, where whatever you think their true win equity in America probably doesn't hold true during some of these link style European courses. Both Fleetwood and Hatton graded as top 10 projected Open Championship players long-term in my model. Each landed as a top 10 player on similar courses when you run comp projections for this course. And then the biggest factor, and this is the value answer that we always talk about, is where I am landing on each of these with my perception of them versus the perception of the sports book and the public. My model has this belief where their win equity is better than the price tag we're getting, where the general public here sees these somewhat reduced in their minds 25 and 28 to 1 totals. And, you know, the answer I've heard repeatedly on the Fleetwood ticket at 25 to 1 is, well, Fleetwood doesn't win golf tournaments. Well, okay, Fleetwood maybe doesn't win golf tournaments, but Fleetwood does win golf tournaments when they're not in America. And that's kind of where my numbers are pushing here, to where he is just a completely different player on one of these Open Championship courses. I would give a very similar answer to Hatton here. So I'm going to bet on what the upside of my model actually believes compared to these prices. I don't think this is as short as the general public seems to believe. Thought 25 and 28 to 1 were very enticing. I took Cameron Smith at 50 to 1. That was a golfer. I wrote about it in Action Network articles pre-event. I wrote about Action Network articles during the event. Like, funny enough to that answer, I had a round 3 matchup of Colin Morikawa over Cameron Smith, bet 1. Had a round 4 matchup of Tommy Fleetwood over Cameron Smith. Like, those are like the 2 headline picks for my card. But the difference is here is you had Cameron Smith as a golfer that everybody wanted to back throughout pretty much every major to start this year. Masters performance was fine, wide open facility. You don't necessarily get it to be as wide open as you would want here. There's real penalties that we've talked about, but the real significant difference for me, and I understand the numbers I'm going to give here don't necessarily present the most optimism, but 129th at the US Open when I looked at projected off the tee production. He jumps into the top 75 here. That still leaves a lot to be desired. If you want to say that that ruins his lack of upside a little bit, sure. I can get behind that marginally, but I think we get a boosted price at 50 to 1 on a golfer where the market has turned in the opposite direction, who is also the number 1 player for me in expected short game production. We've seen Cameron Smith at courses in the past. Think of the Players' Championship. That is not a venue where I would expect Cameron Smith's driving to be able to find success. And yeah, you can make the argument that it was all the putter and all the short game and all of those other nuanced factors, but his short iron proximity is going to play well here. He always has that ace up his sleeve to where at any moment he can go nuclear with his short game. And if my model's telling me that the driver isn't as big of a detriment here, thought 50 to 1 was an interesting number. You can find this at 60 to 1 if you really shop around. And then the last wager, like Nick alluded to this at the beginning, if it's not Finau, it's Alex Noren. In every single major for Noren, I would say Finau is every single tournament in general. One of us has him, but I can't really recall very many major championships where Nick and I, between the two of us, one of us doesn't find a reason to put him on the card. I got him at 135 to 1 when this opened on Monday. That number has gotten obliterated. You can still find this if you shop around in the triple digit zone. Most of the legal books out there have it more in the 80 to 90 to 1 range. You can maybe find a little bit better still, but my model didn't rank him worse than 23rd for any of the 6 main categories I ran. That's going to include a comp course answer of 6th overall and a scrambling return of 4th when I combined overall scrambling and I added that to a player's ability to scramble from out of the sand. This to me, and I think this is a really interesting point to just keep in mind in the future. When a player is not qualified, Aaron Rai was maybe more of the noteworthy one that everybody realized qualified. But when a player is not qualified, and it took the Genesis Scottish Open for Alex Noren to get into this event, it was one of those things where any of the content that was released early didn't include Alex Noren because he wasn't a name that was in the tournament. Books were really soft with the pricing when it started because I don't think they had an indicator of where this was going to go. And I thought that his number, and you could even make an argument, like, look, we can have a discussion of what Aaron Rai's actual upside is for these events. He's a different golfer over the last 6 months. I thought both of those 2 names, I didn't get there with the Rai ticket, but I thought those were 2 names that the market was far too low on because they weren't in the tournament. And we're seeing the correction take place right now. Like, those are 2 of the more significant movers over the past 24 hours. And I think I think it's rightfully so because books dropped the ball where they were initially opened up on the odds board.
I agree. I actually have futures on both Noren and Rye. So shout out to Aaron Rye for going low on Sunday and getting into the Open, because there's no worse ticket than one where you bet on a guy who's not even in the tournament. But before we get into my card, or actually, Spencer, I wanted to touch on one thing you noted. You stated that Colin Morikawa has gained strokes throughout the bag, all four key strokes gain metrics: approach, off the tee, around the green, and putting. 5 straight tournaments. I noted earlier this season, entering the PGA Championship, entering the U.S. Open, that he'd never done that for more than 2 tournaments in a row, and now he's done it 5 times. So uncharted territory for Colin Morikawa. He's playing well throughout the bag, and that's something that I think is key entering the Open Championship, where you need to be in total control of your ball, especially off the tee, especially into these smaller greens than most other Open Championship venues. But before we get into my other bets, Nick, who you got on your outright card this week, and did you add Tony Finau?
I did. Finau 50-1. We'll start there. Had to do it. Great number. I had him at 42-1, so decent value on the ticket. My worry about him is fairways and everything, but I do think, like, looking at, obviously it's a different course from 2016. A lot of these guys did kind of bomb and gouge this place. Steve Stricker finished solo fourth, obviously hit a ton of fairways. Sergio is just a great total driver, which I will kind of segue that into one of where I went at the top of the board, someone I've been kind of betting at majors most of this year. Then he got Beef Johnson. Remember that guy? He was a great Twitter follow. Solo eighth, like, just a lot of guys inside this top 15 that were excellent short game players. So I think that kind of adds more value to what Spencer was talking about with the wedge play. I think that's something I will certainly weigh a little bit heavier as we kind of move overnight and see what that weather looks like. But the top of my board, my decision was Scotty or not to Scotty. We've mentioned it so many times on the show. I don't think we'll ever get there unless he's, greater than 8-1. I think this is a perfect course for him. I know most courses and anywhere in the world are probably a great course for him, but when he could be long and hit fairways and use that wedge play that we're talking about and deep value putting a little bit, like, it's probably his to lose. I love Morikawa. I do think he's one of the best plays on paper. I'm scared to hell to see what his DFS ownership's going to come in at, but I don't know how you fade it. But I started my card here with Jon Rahm at 25-1. Obviously, the form, everything that's going on with Jon Rahm, we have no idea. I know he was coming off that injury with the foot. It sounds like that's back. He hit the ball well at Live. From the 20 minutes that I looked at it and saw a little bit of his shots, he looks like Jon Rahm. No one's talking about him. His open history is absolutely fantastic. His mid-iron play and wedge play is fantastic. He is one of the best drivers of the golf ball in all the PGA Tour and all the world, I should say, now that he's not PGA Tour. But 25-1 just seemed like something I had to jump on. Again, it's probably lighting money on fire, and this is more of a DFS play at the end of the day with Jon Rahm. But I really do think he has significant win equity. It's just, what Jon Rahm do we see here this week? But when I didn't go at the top of the board, like in the 15s, like Xander caught my eye too. He's going to catch everybody's eye. I just decided Jon Rahm was kind of my guy just based on the history that we see here, and no one's talking about him. And maybe he comes out a little bit pissed off, which I'm all for it. I was very surprised to see value in my numbers at Victor Hovland. I know he was one of my favorite plays last week, and his iron play just kind of went by the wayside the first 2 rounds, but he did get that back on Saturday. He still found a way to score at the Genesis, and I think that if his iron play is the one that was missing, if as long as that comes back to form, I'm never worried about Victor Hovland and his iron ball strike, and that he has a ton of upside here. One of the best drivers of the golf ball in all the world again. So kind of see the theme of my card. And then I went down the board a little bit further to someone that looks exactly like Sergio's profile in 2016 when he had a lot of success here. I know that Henrik and Phil kind of just routed everybody, but Brooks Koepka at 45-1. I don't know if I've ever bet him in the last 2 years, 3 years, and I'm sure at majors that's kind of been a killer for me. Open history championships, not fantastic, but I had him at 35-1, so to get 10 points of value on Brooks. Again, another guy that no one's talking about. The live form, kind of sketchy, but a great driver of the golf ball, a great wedge player. And if anybody's going to get hot with a putter, like Spencer mentioned with Cam Smith, I think Brooks Koepka is a guy that I'd rather back with a driver that I do value. Corey Connors at 70-1. Like Siwoo Kim, kind of checks every single box for me. So I don't need to get into him. The ball striking, he's just like a walking top 10 right now. I think it's only a matter of time. Maybe a major is probably not the time to back him, but if this win does get pretty heavy. I do think Corey Connors and his ball striking and all the win stats that you could find with him, he's going to be a guy that could go out there and shoot, 2 or 3 under on a day that the conditions are terrible and get a couple strokes on the field that way. We mentioned Tony Finau, Siwoo Kim at 110-1. Roberto, I believe he's probably on your card. I'll let you have that one. And then one of the biggest value tickets that I had, form's a little bit of a mixed bag, but Keegan Bradley at 250-1. I had this proper at like 145. So obviously my numbers maybe have the equity spread out a little bit more than putting Scotty Scheffler at 4-1 because my numbers will never pump that out. I think I have him proper at 7. But Keegan Bradley, I think, is another guy that no one's going to be talking about. The only thing that they will talk about is the Ryder Cup captain, which kind of caught everybody by surprise. Personally, like just seeing Keegan Bradley and the competitor that he is, I feel like he'd rather be on the team than to be the captain of it. But I think this is his chance to kind of get riled up with Europe a little bit. He's a diehard competitor. He checks every single box. He's very similar to Siwoo Kim without the form and the finishes so far this year. But 6 weeks ago, Keegan Bradley was entering into great form. I think we were talking about him going into the Texas swing. I love Keegan at this course. I know his open history is sketchy, but he did play here in 2016. I think he finished inside the top 20. Coming back now with the Ryder Cup love behind him and going back to a course that he had recent success with, I guess, earlier on in his career, I'll roll the dice at 250-1.
I like the Keegan play. I think it's pretty similar to the Adam Scott play last week in that he's got everything you're looking for. Hasn't necessarily put the pieces together since the Sony Open in Hawaii when I backed him and he needed a birdie on the par 5 18th to win the tournament. Did not make birdie like basically everybody else and then lost in the playoff to Grayson Murray. I like the Keegan play. I think there's upside there. And I think if you want to be more aggressive and play him in some other markets like top 10, top 20, I think that's an interesting route to play. I do have Siwoo Kim on my card, have him 120-1. I've got a lot of futures this week. I like that the Open is wide open, no pun intended, in that there's weather potentially, there's a lack of distance necessary, like unlike other courses like the Masters or Valhalla. So I've been adding to my card for a while, whether it was late 2023 when markets opened up, or earlier this season, or even just last week when I got a couple of decent numbers that I figure would be better than are available this week. So I've got Siwoo Kim at 120-1. I love the ball striking. Can he get there with the putter? Probably not, but I'm paying to find out. I've also got the Aaron Rai future and the Alex Noren futures that we noted earlier, so I'm not going to discuss that any further. I found Sungjae Im at 75-1 earlier this week, and I thought that Sungjae Im had a lot of similarities with Colin Morikawa. A couple years ago, I used to bet these guys to win all the time, and I love Sungjae Im because he played every week at that period of time in his career. So you've always got somebody to watch and root for if you're betting on Sungjae Im. But Sungjae has gained throughout the bag in 2 of the last 3 tournaments. Last tournament, he was just barely negative off the tee, just fractionally. So basically 3 straight tournaments where he's gained throughout the bag. I love that he's more accurate than long off the tee. Although he is around the average driving distance, it's not going to be an advantage though. So he is playing great golf, top 12s in each of his last 3 tournaments, top 12 finishes in 5 of his last 6. He's just in control of his golf ball. I think he's got a great chance to win. And at 75-1, it was a number grab that I couldn't pass up. I've also got Tony Finau on my card. Love the iron play for him. Love that he has the length, but we've talked about how he can do well on some club down courses as well. Also solid in the wind. I like Tony Finau. I think that if there's a course where he's backable to win, it's somewhere with smaller greens that are going to be slower. And that's exactly what happens this week. He also has noted in the past that I think he likes the slower greens a little bit. Won in Mexico Open a couple of years ago on some similarly slow and coastal conditions. So hopefully that gets us across the finish line. He's my favorite one this week among the bets I've made since Monday at 50-1. I got a future on Sahith Theegala at 100-1. So I bet him at Valhalla and at the Masters as well in futures. So this is just a bet that I made on Theegala and his upside being higher than it was being priced in the market around November, December of last year. So I've got that going. I do like Theegala at the going rates around 50-1 as well. So if you're a fan of him, came pretty close last week at Scottish Open. He is what a lot of people have considered a younger Jordan Spieth in that he's kind of wild off the tee, but he's got the it factor around the green, super creative. He had a sweet mega flop on, I think it was Sunday or Saturday at the Scottish Open. Really fun watch. And I like his chances of pulling down an Open at some point in his career. I also have Corey Connors. I think I bet him last week at 100 to 1. Love the ball striking. Obviously, he's straight off the tee. He's relatively long. He can do it all with his irons. The questions arise inside of 50 yards with him with the short game and the putting. But I believe there is some reason to be optimistic for Corey Connors. The Canadian around the green has gained strokes in 5 consecutive tournaments, and he's gained strokes with his putter in 3 of the last 5 tournaments, including last week when he tied for 10th at the Scottish Open. He, in those 3 times that he's gained strokes, has done so by a considerable margin, gaining over 3.5 strokes for the tournament in those 3 out of 5 times. So I like that solidifies that he has more upside than maybe just barely eking across even strokes gained putting. So I I like Corey Connors both in safety markets and in upside markets. I think he is in a great position to potentially win this week. And so at 100 to 1, I couldn't pass that up last week. And I have one last one. That's Akshay Bhatia. He was 150 to 1 earlier this week. I actually bet him a couple weeks ago. And we've been all over him, talked about him at the Rocket Mortgage, talked about him talked about him quite a few times recently. Love his game. I think that this tournament sets up as well for him as any major championship because he's not super long off the tee and because he's more accurate than long. Although I'm a fan of his game throughout the bag, his irons can get scorching hot, and his putter has been one of the biggest turnarounds on the PGA Tour, outside the top 180 in strokes gained putting last year, in the top 30 this year in putting, and he has a lot of momentum there. He's playing great golf. I think a theme throughout the guys that I want to back in the outright market is guys who just entered with a lot of momentum. I know Nick's got a different strategy where he's betting on guys with some number grabs, and I don't hate that at all either. But my strategy was betting guys that I know if the conditions are right and cooperate with them, they're going to have a chance to be in the mix. And there's as much variability at the Open with all the weird bounces, and you could be totally fine or in the gorse. I think there's a lot of variability. I think it's wide open. In theory, if you've got to hit a lot of fairways, Scotty Scheffler is your guy because he hits the most fairways among the long guys. But if it's not Scheffler, I think it's going to be pretty wide open. I do have some room on my card for some other outrights, considering I don't have anybody shorter than 50 to 1. So, Spencer, I appreciate you breaking down the Schauffele versus Morikawa weighing on that decision, the outrights, because I have that 15 to 1 available on Schauffele. I also love Morikawa. If I like the Sung JM bet, I like the Morikawa bet. I don't have room for both of them on my card. So I'm probably going to pick one of those two guys and figure that out once the weather becomes less of an unknown. So I would like to bet one of those guys or keep my card open for some more internet ads. But I'm around 0.6 units and should be between 8 and 10.
Let me ask you guys a question before we officially move on past the outrights. I don't think any of us, maybe you do, Roberto. I know Nick and I are pretty tapped out on bets that we have currently at this moment from what's going to be left on the card. But, I think this is an interesting discussion because if we would have had it last week, we would have had a really long conversation about Robert McIntyre. And I ended up kind of making amends for it by adding him on Saturday night. Not fully. It cost me about 4 units, and 4 units adds up. And that was a mistake that I ended up making, that as I ran numbers on Wednesday and the math kept coming in and I kept trying to figure it out, like McIntyre continued to be the steady climber for me over and over again. And, I think it's an interesting conversation to be had because we have these talks and we've all talked about who we're going to bet this week, but there are golfers, and that's part of what we do at the end of the show is if I gave you a ticket on this, which one would you take? I'm going to flip the script just really early in the show. I'm just going to ask you both the question. You can give me a name or two. A golfer that's, let's say, 50 to 1 to 100 to 1. Who would be one or two of those names that you would like to find a way to get on your card, you wish you would have had on your card, or you like more than the general public seems to be? You can answer it in any of those ways that you want.
Nick?
I would say, yeah, I'll start 50 to 1. I was very close to getting into Hideki. It was between him and Brooks Koepka, and I pushed on Brooks. It's something I never really backed, but yeah, Hideki was one that kind of hurt to not get to. Other than that, Akshay, and Norin. So you guys, at least you guys have them, so the show could be winners if I miss out on it, which I'll be happy with that. And then Russell Henley. I know I bet Russell Henley all the time. He'll probably be my one and done pick. Spoiler there. But I'll say those four: Akshay, Norin, Russ, and then Hideki. I looked at for a long, long time, and just like the only room I had on the card was for someone in his and Brooks' range, and I think Brooks got some life.
Roberto, what about you?
I like the Hideki one. I'd also am very interested in Patrick Cantlay. We discussed Cantlay at length before the US Open, and we talked about how his number just kept dropping and dropping and dropping. And at some point, there's value on the number, even though the form might be a little bit rough. And then he ends up in the final pairing on that Sunday. I think he is undervalued. I don't necessarily love betting him. I hate watching him play because of obvious reasons. I haven't backed him yet. He's one of the guys whom I'm most intrigued by because he's so strong throughout the bag, and I think that's going to be key this week. So Cantlay's intriguing. I also liked Wyndham Clark. He just got so much upside with that putter and the driver, and if conditions are right, I think that could be he's a different type of player than the ones that I've been backing in the outright market. So kind of a cross correlation bet on weather potentially. I think he's just got a ton of upside, and we bet him in tournaments where we didn't necessarily think he was the perfect fit, like at Pebble Beach earlier this year when he was 100-1, and at some point just the number becomes too big. So those were the guys that really stood out to me in that 50 to 100-1 range.
It's funny you both gave the answer in a different way of the two players that I was really asking this question for. So the two golfers that I was the closest to, I looked very hard, and you both have talked about it. Like, you have to make a decision. You can't bet everybody. And when I go super top heavy with Morikawa, Fleetwood, and Hatton, then the decision for me became, do I want Cameron Smith or do I want one of these other two golfers? Hideki Matsuyama, I look so hard. That is the one of any of the names that is going to be my biggest regret if he gets across the finish line. Super close to making my card. Patrick Cantlay would be the second one.
I'm itching at an in-pod play on Cantlay. I'm not quite there, but I am keeping Cantlay. I'll throw Matsuyama in there, and then Morikawa and Schauffele as my four top outrights to consider, because I do have room on my card with only bets at 51 or longer. So I'm very intrigued by those guys. And Cantlay, I believe, has been drifting. So maybe that drift keeps happening. And if I can get 55, 60 to 1, I think I'll punch a ticket. So I'll watch that space on him. I forgot we've got the Barracuda Championship also going on this week on the PGA Tour stateside in the Lake Tahoe area. Last year, you might recall that Akshay Bhatia knocked in a 12-footer on the 72nd hole to get into a playoff with Patrick Rogers. Patrick Rogers, Stanford Cardinal, 11-time winner at Stanford, tied with Tiger Woods as the most winning golfer in Stanford history. Did not come through. His tee shot on the first playoff hole lands in a divot in the fairway. He was absolutely screwed because of that. Ends up making like a double, I think. I don't even think he holed out. But Tia made an easy par and won for the first time on the PGA Tour. And now he's on my card at the Open Championship. But going to the Barracuda, there are two guys that stand out to me. The first one stands out much more than anybody else. I texted you guys yesterday. Well, I texted you guys a couple weeks ago saying that Kevin Yu was going to win this tournament. But I was hoping to bet him around 50 to 1. He opens at 30 to 1. He's now 32 to 1 at Bet365. So it's a pass for me for now, but I am intrigued by Kevin Yu. He's just got the big putting issue that I need a little bit longer number to back. But somebody who has shown that he can absolutely roll the rock is Nick Dunlap. And he's got a ton of upside. Obviously, winner already on the PGA Tour this season at the American Express. But he hits the ball a mile. His approach play is really strong as well. And he's a good putter. His short game's not great, and he doesn't always hit as many fairways. But I think he's got as much upside as anyone in the field this week at the Barracuda. Keith Mitchell's a betting favorite at 17 to 1. Michael Thorbjornson's 24 to 1. Taylor Pendrith 24 to 1. Sam Stevens 27, and Patrick Rogers 27. That's everybody under 30 to 1. I like Dunlap more than any of those guys, and he's at 45 to 1. So give me Nick Dunlap all day. I think I'm going to bet him to win 12 units here because I think there's that big of an edge there. And then I'm just going for 7 units on JJ Spawn. I bet him last week at the ISCO Championship, which is a lot of fun to watch. By the way, that 18th hole at Keene Trace in Nicholasville, Kentucky, awesome finishing hole where there's drama. Wish there would have been a little bit more water, although Pearson Coody got to play it in the playoff off of the mud over there on the right. It was pretty fun to watch. I like those fun 18th holes where there is a stiff penalty looming, but also a birdie opportunity. So I'm backing JJ Spawn again, but I really like Nick Dunlap. If you can only bet one person, that's who I'm betting at the Barracuda. Also wanted to give a reminder that the Links and Locks podcast is proudly presented by Bet365. Bet365 doesn't do ordinary, and that's why you get more boosts with them than with anyone else. Every day, they power up the odds on hundreds of bets to give you a chance to win more. Bet365 boosts specific markets, your winnings, and even parlays, and they don't stop there. Keep an eye out for their biggest and best odds with the incredible Super Boost. Check out the boost and see why it's never ordinary at Bet365. Must be 21 or older and present in Arizona, Colorado, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, North Carolina, New Jersey, Ohio, Virginia, or 18 and older in Kentucky. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. Terms, conditions, and restrictions apply. Gentlemen, we've gotten through our outright cards. Spencer, I'll sling it to you first. Who else do you have on your betting card this week for the 152nd Open Championship?
I don't have anything else right now. I'm trying to let weather finalize itself a little bit. Gonna run numbers again in the morning for the matchup market. I didn't have anything that I love for the placement bets. Got very close to trying to figure out a way. I know I faded Billy Horschel last week. I kind of like Horschel this event. I just couldn't figure out a way to get exposure to him. I texted you guys yesterday trying to figure out a way. How do I get Aaron Rye onto the card? Couldn't necessarily do that either. Probably just going to be an in-tournament betting week, and maybe I can find another matchup or two. But I didn't think, I mean, I know it's a major championship, and maybe this is just something that everybody needs to hear out there, so I'll just say it. Like, just because it's a major championship doesn't mean that you need 100 units in play. If there's not value on the board, there's not value, and that's kind of where my model has landed right now.
That was well said. Nick, anything else on your card this week?
Keegan Bradley, top 40, where ties paid in full at plus 160.
I like it. If we had the similar play, top 20 on Adam Scott, which got to the window last week, so hopefully Keegan Bradley can cash that top 40 at plus 160, where ties are paid in full. I've got a couple other ones. I noted already that I like Corey Connors kind of throughout, both safety and upside. I've got him for top 20 at plus 260. I like Russell Henley, Nick's boy, at plus 120 for a top 40 where ties pay in full. He's just a really solid golfer who is putting better than he has been throughout the majority of his career. Super accurate off the tee and seemingly always underrated approach play. That gives him really high floor. I don't know that he can win, but I like him for the top 40 market. I think it's a generous price. And then my last one is the Siwoo Kim top 20 at plus 350. Backed him last week for the top 40 and top 60. I'm going to get a little bit more aggressive with top 20 this week at the bigger number. And Nick also has one for the top 40. So hopefully we can cash both of those in one fell swoop. All right, gentlemen, we took it on the chin last week with Robert McIntyre winning at the Scottish Open. Basically half of our pool had Robert McIntyre. So that wasn't great for Nick or me. Spencer, I think you had him.
I did.
This week.
Yeah. Even when something goes well, the entire group has him. It's like I still made up no ground.
I'll get it started. I'm still in second. I want to play Tyrrell Hatton, but our venerable leader, Michael Leboff, who went from about $1 million ahead of me, is now $2.6 million ahead of me after he cashed in Robert McIntyre. He has Hatton available. I don't know that I can play Hatton if he has Hatton available. I know that Bryson is not available for Leboff, so I'm considering playing Bryson or Hatton, probably leaning toward Bryson just because I know I have to get different. And this is one of the 3 opportunities where we got a $3.5 to $4.5 million prize pool for the winner. So I'm either going to play Bryson, I think. I'd like to play Hatton if I can figure out if Leboff isn't playing Hatton. Somebody let me know. Or I'll find somebody else, maybe like a Cantlay whom Leboff might have used before. I think those are my top 3 routes. Those are my top 3 options right now. Nick, who are you considering?
Russell Henley or Bryson is what I have available. I wish I wouldn't play John Rahm right now unless I was like lower down in the standings. But yeah, Russ is probably going to be my guy this week.
All right, so Nick is still in third, right behind me. Spencer, who you got for one and done this week?
I don't really have players left. I'll probably go the live route. I'm kind of in the same boat that you are, Roberto, where Wyndham Clark is going to be saved. You don't have him, or you still have him, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so I'm sure we're gonna probably play him around the same time. Like, there's just a different mentality for me. I'm trying to make the most cuts I can make. For me, that's gonna either be Cameron Smith, Hatton, DeChambeau. Play one of the live guys. Keep my player pool open for the last couple events of the year.
I think that makes a ton of sense. Gentlemen, let's go to a rapid fire real quick. We've got, let's see whom we haven't discussed it at length yet. Ludwig Oberg. Actually, before we can get to Ludwig Oberg, let's talk some Rory McIlroy. He is 8-1 in the outright market. Scotty Scheffler is 5.5-1. If you got a magical fairy to give you a free outright bet on one of these two guys to win 10 units, which one would you take, Nick?
I go Ludwig.
Oh, sorry. I meant Scheffler at 5.5-1 or Rory at 8. We'll get to Ludwig.
Oh, Scheffler. Sorry.
Spencer?
I'm gonna give a surprising answer. I'm gonna say Rory. I have some concerns. I know it's a better course fit for Scheffler for all the reasons we've talked about, and these are going to be famous last words talking about Scheffler's not winning a golf tournament when he clearly has all the pieces outside of the putter to do so. I worry a little bit about the negative trajectory with the putter, just like the same reasons why I worried about it at the US Open. He's going to have an ability to separate himself with these smaller greens and his driving accuracy. And like, I agree with Nick's answer. To me, if he was 8-1, we could have a different discussion. Like 7-1, 8-1 is more of like the proper price for him. But I didn't have Rory that different than the number that I got on Scotty. So if you're going to give me 3 extra points, kind of a wild answer to give for a golfer who against a golfer who continues to win, but maybe that's just me having an addiction to Rory that I mean, I've been on him every major this year. This is going to be the first time that I'm not. It's going to be painful if he does win. So if a little fairy came down and wanted to give me that ticket, I wouldn't mind it.
Spencer, you had Ludwig Oberg along with me last week at the Genesis Scottish Open. Unfortunately, he did not cross the finish line. He's 15-1. If you had to bet him at 15-1 or Tommy Fleetwood at 22-1, well, which one would you take?
Well, I'll take Fleetwood since that's
you already have Fleetwood.
Yeah, but I guess the argument that I would make against Oberg in this spot, when he was 18-1 last week, that was much more of the ideal opportunity, in my opinion, to try to get exposure to him. We always have a golfer or two. I thought Colin Morikawa was that name at the US Open, where they get very close to winning an event right before the major championship, and we see their odds end up plummeting. I mean, there's really no other way around it. They plummet to a point where there's really no value on the return. So I think Oberg, as much as I like him, I do think he's a top 6 projected win equity player. I'm starting to think that we've entered a range on this outright number where this is not where I want to be.
He was 16-1 on Wednesday of last week to win the Open, plummeted to around 12-1, and was there on Sunday through Monday, then has meandered back to 15-1. So he's starting to move back to where he was, but a lot of the other golfers who were in that 16-ish to 1 range had some drift on Monday morning, and he did not obviously have that. So that makes a ton of sense. Nick, I know you don't have Tommy on your card. Between him at 22 and Ludwig at 15, which one would you like?
Tommy. Just because it's Ludwig's first time. Give me Tommy. And obviously a little bit of a heartbreak last week, kind of blowing up at the back 9 there.
I think it's a great course fit for Tommy. Spencer, you discussed this, but if there's ever a time, maybe it's this week. Moving down the board, Bobby Mack is 32-1. Shane Lowry is 40-1. Between the two guys that I would most like to share a pint with on the PGA Tour, you had to punch an outright ticket. Spencer, which one would you punch?
Well, it's funny you say that. The answer I was going to give is I assume McIntyre has not stopped drinking. And when drinking is involved, I just assume Shane Lowry is around. So I don't know if I necessarily want exposure to either one of them. I mean, if you made me pick one, I'll take Shane Lowry.
Nick, you look like you agree.
Yep, give me Shane. He can handle his stuff. Guy's a veteran.
I'd also take Shane Lowry. I think that McIntyre might be the most overpriced golfer on the board. And statistically, he's not in the same rarefied air as the other golfers in this odds tier. However, he had his best week on approach this entire season last week. The only time where he's gained more than one stroke per round with his irons over four rounds this year, he wins. And a couple weeks before that, he had not gained more than 1.5 strokes per round with his putter in a single tournament for 4 rounds. He gained 2.8 per round at the RBC Canadian Open, and he wins. So he's had his 2 ceiling weeks, and he's won. You got to give him credit for winning when he had his best stuff, but those are his absolute ceilings, and he just doesn't have that high of a ceiling relative to the other guys here because he's not a great iron player, and I think you're going to need to be this week with the smaller greens. But when you're Bobby Mack and you can roll the rock as well as anybody in the world, in my opinion, right now over the last few months, I think the smaller greens are a disadvantage to him relative to the other open golf courses. So I think he's somebody that I'd like to bet on a St. Andrews or somewhere else where he can mash the driver a little bit more and take advantage of the lag putting and 2 putting for birdies and pars throughout the rounds. But Bobby Mack, fun guy to watch. And hopefully he's living it up right now, as he should be. Moving along down the board, Tom Kim is 45-1. We discussed Patrick Cantlay, so we'll skip him at 45. We'll skip Brooks Koepka as well. Sahith Theegala is also 45-1. And Minwoo Lee is 55-1. And you know what? Let's throw in Adam Scott at 60. So between the Australians at 55 and 60, Tom Kim at 45, and Sahith Theegala at 45 as well. Spencer, if you had to take a ticket on one of these guys, who would it be?
Tom Kim was another name that wasn't immediately canceled off my consideration list. He'd be behind Hideki and Cantlay, but not so much so to where he's not in that same range of options I'm considering. So I'll go with Tom Kim.
I like Tom Kim, tied for second here, or tied for second at Royal Liverpool in the Open Championship last year. And I think he's just made for the Open Championship. Guy who finds fairways, strong iron play, and can roll the rock as well. I like Tom Kim. That's going to be an evergreen tweet in the Opens. Nick, among those guys, who do you like?
I'm going with Thiegs. I think it's only a matter of time. This guy's, I think, found a way to succeed on club down courses. If he needs to hit less than driver and find fairways, I trust him to do it.
I like it. Maybe that could be the recipe for success that keeps him on track. And like we talked about with Jordan Spieth, it's helped him in the past. So maybe it could work with Theegala. Moving along, we'll end it with this one. Joaquin Niemann is 60-1. Sung J M is also 60-1. Spencer, you bet this guy last week, Matt Fitzpatrick, he's 65-1. Cameron Young, first time we've seen him since he cracked his driver shaft, well, in contention at the Rocket Mortgage Classic. He is 65-1. And then additionally, Louis Oosthuizen, 65-1. And Brian Harman, 75-1. If you had to punch a ticket on one of those guys, Spencer, who would it be?
So the Louis ticket, it was much better when it was 110-1. I think you've moved the number, the industry, not you in particular, Roberto. The industry has moved the number too far from where it's at. So you might have been the one that moved it if you had the outright ticket, but that's a different discussion. I guess I'll go with Fitzpatrick for a lot of the reasons that I talked about with Hatton and Fleetwood. The only caveat that I'll throw into that mix is it really will matter what you think this winning score is going to get to. Closer to, I don't think we get the single digits, but the closer we are to 10, 11, 12 under, the more upside I would say Fitzpatrick has. If this starts getting to 20 under par, which I don't necessarily think it's going to, but if it gets to 20, I don't know if he can get across the finish line there. So I'll go with him. Sungjae would probably be the honorary mention. He's been terrible in some of these spots in the past. He's going to be very popular for DFS. Do think he's kind of a high upside, low floor sort of play, which doesn't necessarily always work out well for DFS with that answer, but I'll go with Fitzpatrick.
Nick, before I sling it to you on this one, I wanted to note that American players have won each of the first 3 majors so far this year in 2023 and 2024. There's not been an American season sweep in the men's majors in a year where all four were played since 1982. Tom Watson won two of those. Craig Stadler got one, and Raymond Floyd got one. So interesting storyline to keep an eye on this week. That was via Justin Ray, as always, on Twitter, the stats golf overlord. Nick,
My card is mainly internationals, right? Rahm, Hovland, Connors, Siwoo, but about even. We got Brooks and Keegan to round out the Americans, but all right, I like my odds in.
among these guys in this group, most of them are internationals. Any of them stand out to you?
I like Fitz. I want to get different than Spencer there, but I don't really like the other options. I'm going with Fitz. I do worry about his overall ball striking. It's just such a mixed bag here and there. But if scores are right around that 7 to 12 under range, I think that's a spot where Fitz can succeed. And his driver has been very accurate and relatively long.
I feel like a kid in the candy shop at the Open Championship betting board. Just there are so many different styles who can succeed, and you get them at longer prices than usual. It's fun. Don't go overboard, though. Of course, bankroll management is a key part of golf handicapping. Gentlemen, this is a lot of fun. Hopefully, we add a winner to our tally this year with the majors. Spencer, where can we find your work this week?
You can find me on Twitter at TL Sports. I will have all my in-tournament articles over at Action Network. If you like any of the numbers that you heard, you can get that over at Rotoballer inside of my model.
Awesome. Nick, where can we find your work this week?
My overall picks and DFS board over at Win Daily Sports, on Twitter at StixPicks, STIXPICKS, and the best bets at Ashkin Network. And maybe tonight, I guess, our Better Golf DFS show, Better Golf Pod on Twitter or X, whatever you call it these days.
You can find it right on his hat. So be sure to tune in for that. Should be a lot of fun to hear what you guys have to say on DFS as I am wading into those waters this week. I am excited that I'm breaking down my power rankings. I'm doing the top 52 golfers for the 152nd Open Championship. You can find that on Wednesday morning at Action Network. It's a behemoth of a file. Apologies in advance to anybody who has to edit it, but it should be a lot of fun to see everybody that I think can win broken down and talking about how I'm betting these guys or how I target them, even if I'm not betting them. So excited for that. Put a lot of work on it. You can find tons of content on the Action Network. As you guys have noted, we got best bets. We got Spencer's in-tournament articles as well, where he might give some matchups. He might give a live outright ad like he did with Robert McIntyre on Saturday night. So be sure to tune into those. Got tons of great content, whether you're looking at WNBA, looking at the Olympics coming up, everything. We've got you covered at the Action Network. So be sure to check it out. We've got a lot of content that I'm very proud of to be a part of here at Action. I want to give one big final thank you to everyone who makes this podcast possible, starting with you, the listeners, and especially our producers, Noah Niederhofer, David Payne, and Matt Mitchell. You can find Nick on Twitter at StixPicks. You can also find Spencer on Twitter at TOff Sports. You can find me on Twitter at RobertoA213. Thanks for listening to our betting preview for the Open Championship. And here's to hope that we can become the champion bettors of the year.